When people think of the world's tallest mountain, they think Everest. Big, famous, dangerous. But what if I told you it's not the deadliest? Because there's a mountain that doesn't look as tall on paper. But once you step onto it, you realize it's not just a climb, it's a fight for your life. It's not as tall as Everest, but it's a harder climb. While Everest starts you off at 17,000 feet, Denali rises from near sea level. That means you're hiking all 18,000 feet yourself, 5,000 more vertical feet than Everest. And then the weather hits. Denali doesn't warn you. It strikes. Winds blast over 100 miles per hour. Temperatures sink below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold cuts straight through your gear. Oxygen feels thinner than it should. And the mountain is so remote. Help isn't just far, it's almost unreachable. Up here, the cold doesn't sting, it wipes you out. And in 1967, it wiped out 7 men. This is the true story of the worst mountaineering disaster in American history. 7 climbers, 1 brutal mountain, and the worst storm in 100 years. This is the 1967 Denali disaster. In 1966, Joe Wilcox was just 24, but already a seasoned climber with over 50 summits above 10,000 feet across the US. That kind of resume was rare for someone his age, and now he was looking for his next big challenge. That summer, Joe was deep in the Alaskan wilderness, cutting trees near the Panhandle. Long, quiet days gave him time to think, and one mountain kept calling to him. The tallest, the wildest, the most dangerous on the continent, Mount Denali. Back then, it was still called Mount McKinley, but its original name, Denali, the High One, in the Koyukon language, was slowly making a comeback. Either way, Joe had made up his mind. He was going to climb it. He started by reaching out to 2 trusted friends, Jerry Clark and Mark McLaughlin. Jerry, older and well-connected, took the lead on recruiting. Joe handled the logistics. He estimated each climber would need to contribute $300, about $2,000 today, for gear, food, and travel from Seattle to Alaska. Together, they sent out a newsletter to a dozen prospects. It included the full game plan, training tips, and reading materials on avalanches and glacier safety. In the end, 9 men signed on. They filed their application with the National Park Service as required, and immediately they hit their first major obstacle. When park rangers reviewed the team's application, one issue jumped out. Yes, they had solid mountaineering skills, but none of them had ever climbed above 15,000 feet. And nearly a quarter of Denali sits above that. Up there, the air is thin, and altitude sickness can hit fast, especially for first-timers. So the rangers made a suggestion. Team up with a more experienced group from Colorado planning to climb at the same time. Joe reached out. The Colorado team agreed to cooperate, but they still wanted to climb separately. But then, a twist. One of their key climbers got into a car accident and broke his arm. Suddenly, their group was too small to meet the Park Service's minimum requirement of 4 climbers. Therefore, rather than cancel years of planning, the Colorado group agreed, reluctantly, to fully join forces with Joe's team. That satisfied the Park Service. The expedition was approved. By late June, they arrived in Alaska, fully loaded with gear and adrenaline. Their plan? Approach Denali from the north via the Muldrow Glacier and climb up Karstens Ridge. Today, most climbers fly in and ascend the West Buttress. But back then, Karstens Ridge was the more common route. Cheaper since it didn't require a flight, but the trade-off downside was that it was far more remote. To reach Camp 1 near McGonigal Pass, the team first had to hike 3 brutal days through mosquito-infested tundra just to get to the base of the mountain. Then, on June 22nd, the real climb began. Unlike Everest, Denali offers no help, no Sherpas, no lodges, just wilderness. So every climber hauls their own load, a 70-pound backpack plus a 150-pound sled packed with food, gear, and supplies. That's over 200 pounds, dragged step by step into thinner air and deeper cold. On a typical day, they'd gain maybe 1,000 feet, moving just 5.5 miles, if they were lucky. The weight would shrink as supplies were used, but the exhaustion stayed. Denali isn't just a climb, it's a grind, and it only got harder. The team was now deep in a frozen world, crevasses, deep snow, and shifting ice fields. Each night, after hours of effort, they had to dig into the snow, shoveling and cutting blocks just to pitch their tents and survive the cold. Progress was slow, but steady. They crept higher along the ever-shifting Muldrow Glacier, eyes always scanning for deadly cracks hidden beneath the snow. They built Camp 2 near the lower ice fall, Then came Camp 3, just before facing the Great Icefall. That was early July, nearly 2 weeks in. Then on July 4th, Camp 4 was set below Harper Icefall. So steep and unstable, it couldn't be climbed directly, so they veered around it via Karstens Ridge. Finally, on July 13th, they carved out Camp 5 at 15,000 feet. Almost a month had passed, and now they were just one camp away from a shot at the summit. But time was running out. The altitude was starting to take its toll. Headaches, nausea, fatigue, but nothing serious yet. Then came a radio update. A major storm was forecasted to hit around July 16th or 17th, but until then, the weather would be perfect. So Joe Wilcox made a call. They had to go now. If they pushed immediately, they could reach High Camp or Camp 7, summit the next day, and descend with time to spare before the storm rolled in. The team agreed. They'd carry 5 days of food, set one more stop, Camp 6 at 16,500 feet, and rest overnight to acclimatize. It would reduce the risk of altitude sickness before their final push. They reached Camp 6 that evening. By morning, the group split. 8 climbers moved ahead toward High Camp. 4 stayed behind to rest and collect more gear. By 7 p.m. on July 14th, the advanced group established High Camp at 18,000 feet. Everything was going to plan. The weather was still holding. On July 15th, 4 climbers, Joe, 1 teammate, and 2 from Colorado, left for the summit around noon. The rest stayed behind, waiting for the final 4, still en route from Camp 6. Conditions were nearly perfect. Clear skies, light wind, and temps just below freezing. The summit team made great time, climbing 500 feet per hour, stopping only to rest and refuel. At 6:30 p.m., they reached the summit. They were among just 200 people ever to stand there. A tiny, icy plateau with nothing but horizon in every direction. They stayed for over an hour, radioed the others, launched flares, took in the view. But eventually, it was time to head back. By 8 p.m., they began their descent, still bathed in sunlight thanks to Alaska's endless summer twilight. By 10 p.m., they were back at High Camp, just as the last 4 arrived from Camp 6. Now, all 12 were reunited at 18,000 feet. They shared stories, celebrated the summit, and made plans for the next morning. 8 climbers still intended to summit on July 16th. But when they woke up on July 16th, everything had changed. The wind was howling. Gusts slammed into the tents at 70 miles per hour. The summit was off the table. They were pinned down, 12 men crammed in tents, waiting for a break in the weather. Morale began to slide. With only 2 stoves between them and the storm raging outside, some skipped meals, too sick to eat, or too exhausted to gather supplies from other tents. Altitude sickness hit hard, nausea, headaches. Some couldn't keep anything down. The summit now felt impossibly far. After weeks of effort, the mountain was breaking them down. Some of the less experienced climbers began to doubt if they should even try. But then on July 17th, they woke to stillness. No wind, no flapping tents, just silence. The mountain had calmed. They regrouped. After eating and weighing their options, 7 of the 8 remaining climbers decided to go for it. 1, Anshul, was too sick. He would descend, along with the 4 who had already summited. Around noon, that group of 5 packed up and began heading back down to Camp 6. As they moved, they occasionally looked back at High Camp, expecting to see the others gearing up. But by 2 p.m., the summit team still hadn't left. They were still in their tents, still moving around. Something didn't feel right. Everyone had agreed. Summit attempts had to start early, and for good reason. The upper slopes were too dangerous to be exposed on late in the day. But now, the second team was setting out far too late. And not with 7 climbers, just 6. 1 had fallen too ill and stayed behind at High Camp. The others pushed upward into thinning air. A few hours in, the weather began to shift. Clouds built fast. This wasn't just a passing storm. Denali's beauty is its danger. It rises steep and alone, a massive wall that intercepts storms straight from the Pacific. There's no mountain range to soften the blow, so weather hits Denali hard. And that's just the start. Its proximity to oceans, constant exposure to the polar jet stream, and location just 3 degrees below the Arctic Circle all combine to create some of the fiercest mountain weather on Earth. Even Everest doesn't get hit like this. That evening, the summit team radioed in. They were somewhere high on the slopes, but lost, disoriented, whiteout conditions, no sense of direction, so they made a desperate decision. Bivouac right there on the mountain. No tent, no shelter, just sleeping bags in the snow. Amazingly, they checked in again the next morning. At 11:30 a.m., they'd made it. Despite the whiteout and brutal winds, 5 men stood at the top of North America. The wind was howling, the view non-existent, but they had done it. The temperature hovered around 6 degrees Fahrenheit. It should have been a moment of triumph. But something was wrong. Only 5 climbers were there. John Russell was missing. The last anyone had seen of him was the night before. They assumed he had turned back alone, heading for high camp, but no one knew for sure. No radio signal, no trace. Still, the group said they were leaving the summit and would call again once they got down. But they never did, because shortly after that final transmission, the mountain unleashed its full fury. A massive storm system formed directly over Denali, a collision between a low-pressure front from the north and a high-pressure mass from the south. The result, a monster. Winds tore across the mountain at an estimated 150 miles per hour. That alone made walking nearly impossible, especially on exposed ridgelines with zero visibility and no trail to follow. But later models suggested something even worse. Near the summit, wind speeds may have hit 300 miles per hour. If true, that would shatter every known wind speed record on Earth. Even if the numbers are debated, one thing isn't. This was the worst storm mountaineers had ever faced, on any mountain, anywhere. And the wind wasn't alone. A brutal cold front followed. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The 5 climbers near the summit were now blind, freezing, and exposed in a full-blown superstorm. Some believe they tried to bivouac again, possibly just 1,000 feet from the summit. But there was no shelter, no wall, no cover, just a raw, exposed slope, and the storm didn't pass. It raged for 4 straight days, barely pausing, never letting up. Even the team down at Camp 5 was trapped. They couldn't move, couldn't help, could barely step outside. All they could do was wait. The summit was reached on July 18th. By July 19th, the storm worsened. Total whiteout. No one moved. Then, on July 20th, 3 of the strongest climbers from the lower camp tried to go back up to search for the missing. It took them 4 hours to cover just half a mile. Conditions were still brutal. Whiteout. A fresh foot of snow had fallen, wiping out every track. Even their own footprints vanished seconds after being made. Around midday on July 20th, just as the search party turned back, the storm briefly lifted. For the first time in days, Camp 5 had a clear view of the upper slopes. They scanned everything, desperate for a boot trail, a tent, a figure, anything. But there was nothing. No movement, no signals, no sound, just snow and silence. That's when the truth hit. This was now a crisis. They sent out an emergency call to the park rangers, but whatever hope remained disappeared fast. The storm roared back, stronger than before, and kept hammering the mountain through the 21st. At Camp 5, the remaining 5 climbers crammed into a single 3-man tent, trying to conserve heat. Their clothes were soaked, food nearly inedible. The cold made sleep impossible. They endured this again on the night of the 22nd. By the morning of July 23rd, they knew they had to leave. As the skies showed the first signs of clearing, they began their descent from 15,000 feet. Halfway across Karstens Ridge, they met climbers from the Mountaineering Club of Alaska who had come up with hot drinks and dry clothes. One rescuer joined them on the way down. The others kept climbing, searching for the missing. After more than a month on Denali, the survivors reached base camp on July 25th. Joe Wilcox continued alone, trekking to Wonder Lake to call in a helicopter for evacuation. They were battered, heartbroken, and shaken, but they were alive. Meanwhile, the storm didn't stop. It raged until July 28th. Only then could rescuers reach high camp. What they found was devastating. Tents shredded, gear scattered. One climber frozen stiff, still holding a tent pole. The body was too damaged to identify. The next day, 2 more bodies were discovered, near the base of Archdeacon's Tower. Both were frozen upright, locked in place, as if bracing against the wind, unrecognizable. The final 4 were never found. Maybe buried deep in snow, maybe lost to a crevasse, or, as some believe, blown clean off the mountain by winds no human could survive. To this day, the 1967 Denali disaster remains the worst mountaineering tragedy in U.S. history, and with a loss that massive, blame was inevitable. Many pointed fingers at the expedition's leaders, especially Joe Wilcox. But confusion only deepened when the survivors began publishing their own accounts, each one slightly different. Over time, the blame shifted from person to person. Then, years later, meteorologists finally modeled the storm, and the truth became undeniable. No one was to blame. Not even the best gear today could have protected anyone from what hit that mountain. It wasn't survivable. It was, and still is, the most violent storm ever recorded on Denali. So the question is, what would you have done if you were up there when the sky turned against you?